5.5-inch magazine having been removed for conversion into more 4-inch magazine space. The pressure and combustion of the 4-inch magazine bursts into the 15-inch magazine, igniting charge after charge as several hundred tons of propellant ignite almost in an instant. Whilst the new pressure spike is much greater and begins to rip the ship apart in all directions, there is one route that's slightly easier than most. The pressure wave races up the ammunition hoists, pulverizing the anti-flash measures along the way, and as the explosion is now powerful enough to tear the entire battlecruiser, 12-inch plate and all, into two. A few flash doors are no real obstacle. Now a hellstorm of fire, shells, fragments and superheated high-pressure air blasts up into the aft turrets, spilling out of the gun ports, blowing open hatches and sending a colossal fireball racing skywards, along with both of the aft turrets. With the majority of the pressure now relieved, the ship's hull, perforated like a Swiss cheese and barely holding together, is now subject to the immense forces of a 45,000-ton plus vessel undergoing the opening stages of a high-speed turn. The weakened hull twists as inrushing water drags at it. In the forward part of the ship, where some people are still alive, they feel the ship heel to starboard slightly, as the forward part leans out from the portside turn without some of the stabilising effects of the aft third of the ship, and most likely from the fact that tons of water are rapidly flooding what's left of the engineering spaces, especially on the starboard side where the hit occurred. It's possible that what's left of the hull between the two sections likely acts as torsion spring. As the ship slows, the forward part of the ship then twists back to port, but the superheated, stressed, torn and now torqued hull cannot hold much anymore and is in any case rapidly filling with water. The forward part of the ship heels over to port as what's left of the aft sinks quickly, rammed full of water by forward inertia. Alternatively, and perhaps more likely, is that as the flooding progressed through the ship, this induced a free surface effect, as a change in the ship's angle of heel back towards the more normal vertical would have induced a wave of water to rush from starboard to port, compounding the flooding, which then, combined with the understandable lack of stability experienced by only half a ship, induced a rather larger and more permanent heel to port. Now, with water pouring in from the rearmost surviving part of the ship, the forward section begins to sink rapidly by the stern, perhaps assisted on the way by whatever scraps were left attached to the stern before it tore free. The forward turrets fire a last defiant salvo, and less than 3 minutes after the shell arrived, the pride of the Royal Navy has vanished beneath the waves. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. What, according to all the evidence that I can see, appears to be the most likely explanation for why HMS Hood exploded at the time and place that she did. Yes, indeed, it is an incredibly lucky hit, but, as it turns out, the evidence to follow is all there. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.
Many scenarios have been considered looking at what might have happened had that fatal shell not struck Hood at the Battle of the Denmark Strait, in the context of the battle itself. But this then begs the question, what happens next? If Hood survives the Battle of the Denmark Strait, what is her eventual fate? Well, there are a number of options, but Hood had already been hit hard in the battle and would likely take further hits before the end of it. She was also quite badly worn out at this point. She'd stripped a turbine trying to chase down the French battlecruiser Strasbourg during the bombardment of Mers el Kebir, and despite hasty, quick refits here and there, she was really running more on hopes, prayers and duct tape than anything else at this point. Her status as the only British capital ship capable of 30 plus knots that also had the armour and weapons to go toe to toe, at least in theory, with anything she might come across, had kept her in service well after all the signs were there that she desperately needed work. Even pre-war, the plan had been to put her into refit in early 1942, and that had been predicated on if she'd actually last that long without breaking down. So, let us construct a scenario that changes relatively little with regards to the battle itself, and therefore the course of history remains for the moment fairly little changed. In our alternate scenario, everything works out pretty much the same as Hood begins her second turn of port. Bismarck fires her guns, the shells fly out, one plunges down on a course that leads it into the trough of the ship's bow wave, heading right for the aft machinery space below the waterline. But some minor change somewhere. A butterfly in Central Park, a cod that swam left instead of right, a wisp of cloud that changed the surface temperature on a small patch of the ocean near the Azores, whatever, means that part of the natural sea state has resulted in a natural wave just a little bit higher on the shell's path, clipping it just a couple of meters before it should otherwise have hit the water. Not too much force, just enough to drag on the lower half of the shell and just enough impact to start the fuse going. Now, slightly off angle, the shell ploughs into the water, heading down toward Hood's hull. But the difference in angle of entry versus the angle of the shell itself makes it tumble very quickly. So it smashes into the hull plating, practically going sideways, slowing down rapidly even as the shell begins to disintegrate. But the fuse just about does its job, and so the shell explodes just as it's making its way through into the machinery spaces. Instantly, a hole is ripped in the ship's side and tons of water begin pouring in. Hot fragments pepper the bulkhead and pass through, starting small fires in the 4-inch magazine. But the rush of water following through from the rather more significant-sized hole in the ship's side engulfs them. Most of the crew in the aft engine room are relatively mercifully killed in the blast of the shell, and water rapidly floods into here as well. The inner starboard shaft comes to a halt as power is lost. With more thrust on the port than starboard side, and a huge amount of drag from the hull, the Hood lurches to starboard, almost colliding with an on-rushing HMS Prince of Wales. Fragments from the explosion have also pierced the bulkhead dividing the aft and middle engine rooms, and there's a race there to plug the holes and keep the water out, else they lose the inner port shaft as well. Up on the bridge, the loss of speed is noticed, along with the rather violent turn out of line. Reports of the damage reaching the bridge in time, but the smoke billowing from the side of the ship is testament enough. It's clear that Hood cannot keep up with the German ships as it's rapidly losing speed. Prince of Wales thunders past, and Captain Leach, seeing the flagship heeling to starboard, acts on his own initiative and deploys a smoke screen, even as his ship blazes away with an ever-varying number of guns. Gamely, Hood's own gunners add to the barrage until their target disappears behind a thick curtain of smoke. Holland now orders Hood to turn away and open the range, keeping what speed is left going, is exacerbating the flooding and might soon lead to the loss of a second shaft, and fighting in this condition invites at best Hood's further battering as a sitting duck, and at worst the Germans hooking across the British T or Prince Eugen closing to torpedo range. Under covering fire and smoke from Prince of Wales, the British withdraw from combat. Aboard Bismarck, a furious argument breaks out as to whether to follow the British ships or not. Whilst Bismarck's captain is all for it, he is overruled. Bismarck's priority must be to fulfill its mission to hit enemy shipping. Even if damaged, there are still 2 capital ships out there, and Bismarck has already taken a number of hits from Prince of Wales. As the Germans draw out of range and then out of sight, Admiral Holland orders Prince of Wales to continue the pursuit with Norfolk and Suffolk in company. Hood will limp back home in company with the flotilla of destroyers that they'd arrived with, which are just now rejoining the formation. With both inner shafts shut down to allow damage control efforts to stem the flooding and keep speed down so as not to exacerbate the issue, Hood begins the long journey home. Much of the crew is brought forward as the quarterdeck, which was never too far above the sea level, is now near enough constantly awash. Additional aid is requested from home, and Holland decides to head for Iceland. It's far closer than the UK, and without some rather quick additional work, the flooding might spread. Once in Reykjavik harbour, the destroyers are able to lend a hand with pumping, and Hood is in no further danger of sinking. Work continues on shoring up bulkheads, and some basic work is done on trimming the hole in her side. The arrival of additional ships later that week allows a temporary patch to be welded in place and pumping efforts to clear the aft machinery space, at least partially, so that she can get underway. As this work completes, word is received that Bismarck has been sunk by Royal Navy forces far to the south. Thus buoyed, and somewhat more seaworthy, Hood heads for the mainland UK, proceeding at 12 knots so as to not unduly disturb the patching. Thus, June 1941 sees a badly battered Hood limping in, with the amount of damage to her machinery necessitating a complete replacement of at least 1 set of engines, possibly 2, as well as the damage to the upper works from the fire and the rather large hole in the side. There would be little reason to put her through many months of dockyard repairs and get her out in still largely worn-out condition, only to then end up having to recall her months later, possibly after some kind of catastrophic failure at sea. And so it is likely that the plans for her large repair, or to be more accurate, modernisation, would need to be moved forward from the projected date of 1942. Now, it is of course entirely possible that with the wartime pressures on construction and repair, she might just have been patched up or partly refitted and thrown back out there relatively quickly. But given the woeful state of her engines, the mediocre state of her anti-aircraft mountings, and the massively outdated fire control systems, in this scenario, with the Lion-class battleship suspended, the urgent need for modern, fast and well-armed battleships would probably be realised. There's also an interesting confluence of events. HMS Vanguard had been ordered only 3 months earlier, and materials were being gathered for a projected laying down of the ship in October. Whilst Hood could not take Vanguard's place, as the latter was to be built on a slipway, much of the planned upgrades for Hood might use the same items and materials that were being gathered for Vanguard, such as the 5.25-inch secondary batteries, altered 15-inch turrets, Type 274 radar and the like. But since Hood's hull was, well, mostly already there, it would be quicker to modernise Hood than to build and fit out an entirely new ship from scratch, especially as this would allow the diversion of a larger amount of structural steel to other ships that needed completing fast, such as the carrier Implacable, and of course freeing up of the slipway that Vanguard was to be built on. The net result would have been to slow down work on Vanguard, but that's an issue that we'll come back to later. There is one alternate possibility here. HMS Warspite was on her way to Bremerton to spend 5 months getting refitted, and of course Rodney had been on her way to the US when Bismarck broke out. With the US not currently at war, but more than willing to take on good paying work, there is a chance that Hood may have been sent over the Atlantic for a time in dock, as that would be more secure from bombing and work stoppages due to lack of material. But in either case, what was actually going to happen to Hood? In the late 1930s, schemes had been drawn up which anticipated needing about 3 years in dock. This would mean she'd be out of action until about mid-1944, but with pre-gathered materials and a priority on the work, especially if she was in American hands, this would probably have been shortened down to around 2.5 years, maybe less if some elements were left out. Now, it's important to bear in mind that no full documentation about exactly what was planned has survived, or if it has, it's been filed away in some random piece of the National Archives which no one's come across yet. So the following is not conjecture, but based more on notes that have made it through rather than a full detailed plan. Nevertheless, 2 schemes had been proposed. They differed somewhat, but they had the following common features: the provision of new main and auxiliary machinery, the provision of either 5.25 or 4.5 inch dual-purpose mounts, the removal of all existing armament apart from the 15-inch guns in order to facilitate said dual-purpose mountings. Additionally, the provision of 6 Mark 6 pom-pom 8-barrel mounts, removal of the remaining torpedo tubes, provision of a catapult, hangars and aircraft similar to King George V, removal of the conning tower, because no one used it, and the reconstruction of the bridge and superstructure, modifications to underwater protection, including the removal of the crushing tubes from her bulges, provision of increased deck armour, removal of the upper 5-inch armour belt, modifications to the top portion of the bulge in order to provide the stability necessary to support all these changes, and the extension of the aft section of the forecastle deck, which would hopefully partially cure the quarterdeck issues that had occurred in any sea state other than a flat calm. The main differences centred around what was to be done with the ship's armour. Scheme A would see the 7-inch belt replaced with the 12-inch belt being extended all the way to the upper deck, with 2 inches added to the existing upper deck throughout the citadel, which would provide a total of 7 inches of deck armour in 2 layers above the magazine, not including the 1.5-inch uppermost deck plating, which was primarily in place to deal with bombs by detonating them early. Scheme B retained the 7-inch belt and thus had a shorter or shallower 12-inch belt. The deck armour present at the changeover point between the 12 and 7-inch belts would be increased to 5 inches over the magazines and 4 inches over the machinery. In both schemes, the machinery spaces would be further subdivided and speed would be about 31.5 knots at standard displacement and just over 30 knots at deep displacement. The modifications to the underwater protection would include the aforementioned removal of the crush tubes from the buoyancy spaces in the bulges, with oil fuel in the existing wing tanks being transferred to these vacated areas, which would also give the hood a slightly increased amount of range. Due to all this added weight above the waterline, stability would decrease, and that would be countered by alterations to the upper part of the bulges. Scheme A, with the greater belt armour, was weaker than Scheme B against bomb hits amidships, but by adding a bit of deck armour here and there, about 80 tons worth all told, Scheme A was then preferred over Scheme B, as it was held that the following apply. Firstly, the existing barbette armour was weak below the upper deck, and a thick upper deck would be necessary to cover these weak spots. Secondly, better side protection and armoured stability was present in Scheme A, and in this scenario given, she'd just been in a gunfight, and that would have been on the minds of many officers. Thirdly, the protective deck was one deck higher than in Scheme B, which would give her better protection against bombs as they detonate higher in the ship. And fourthly, in Scheme B, the ship would still have the 7-inch upper belt, which would be about 750 tons of useless deadweight, since it was too thin to resist any serious incoming fire the ship might encounter if it was facing off against similarly gunned opponents. Following the then current British doctrine regarding removal of the conning tower and rebuilding the complex bridge and mast structure, would provide more space for command staff and of course new support for features like radar, whilst saving another 600 tons of vital high-mounted weight, since, as we said, no one used the conning tower anyway. The hodgepodge of AA armament would be replaced with the 6 octuple pom-poms and the dual-purpose secondary battery, and the removal of the torpedo tubes would also save weight that could be better used elsewhere. The extension to the forecastle deck, as well as keeping the quarterdeck dry, would also have provided much needed space higher in the ship for the crew. Of course, the new machinery would also save weight and allow more space deep in the ship for additional storage and other new equipment to be installed. At the same time, there would be a debate over the number and type of secondary battery. Her sheer length might allow for a renowned Queen Elizabeth-style refit, using 10 twin 4.5-inch mounts, or maybe even 12. But on the other hand, the improved 5.25-inch mounts for Vanguard would already be in train, and therefore would probably be a more attractive proposition than diverting large numbers of 4.5-inch guns from the carriers and other ships. Therefore, the secondary battery is more likely to have been the 8 improved twin 5.25-inch turrets. Aircraft facilities are another interesting factor, but I believe they would have been retained. HMS Howe was completed with these features, Lion and Temeraire had been planned with them, and historically Vanguard only had these eliminated from her redesign in late 1941 after another revision. Now, whilst arguably there would have been time before the superstructure was built up again in this scenario, I think the pressure to get things going at a fast pace would have mitigated against such a revision, since whilst simply not installing aircraft facilities sounds easy, a lot more work would have been needed to work out what to then do with the resulting space. Although it's also possible that the hangars might have just been left in the design, and the aircraft just not placed inside them, and the launching facilities fitted, again to save weight and time, with the hangar spaces then just being generically used by the crew or for storage. One thing that would have changed is the light and medium anti-aircraft battery. Whilst 48 pom-pom barrels and the 5.25-inch guns would have been a great armament to have in 1941, the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse and the upswing in air attacks generally would likely have seen progressive layers of 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors added to the ship with each year that it spent in dock. The new radar, fire control systems and modified main battery turrets may have changed specifications slightly, but this would largely have likely consisted of simply installing the updated version of the radar or similar systems instead when it came time to actually do so. Now, whilst it is very tempting to imagine a full-speed refit getting her back in time just about to face off against Scharnhorst at the Battle of the North Cape, that would mean repair, refit, recommissioning and back into service in just under 2.5 years. Possible, but unlikely, unless significant corners were cut. More likely, she's going to be back with the fleet in early to mid-1944. But at this point, the war would have changed rather dramatically. All German capital ships would now be long gone, with the exception of the half-crippled Tirpitz in Norway. The Italian fleet has surrendered, and thus the only enemy Hood would have left would be the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific. Fresh, fast, and extensively armed with a large and very considerable anti-aircraft battery, her most likely role would thus have been as a core part of the then growing British Pacific Fleet, likely as a flagship, as she would have the space for the Admiral's staff and the speed to keep pace with the carriers. Sadly, this would mean that she is not likely to see any action against other capital ships, unless some major butterflies see a surface action develop around Operation Tango in 1945, but she would see out the war as an escort to the fleet carriers with occasional shore bombardment duty thrown in. Her sheer size would likely also have made her a prime target for kamikazes off Okinawa, which her new anti-aircraft battery and extensive armour protection would have made her well equipped to deal with, drawing fire from the carriers and possibly sporting a fetching white tropical paint scheme. Post-war, her fate would be quite interesting. With Vanguard still likely far from complete, it's questionable as if the latter ship would be finished as a battleship. Plans for a carrier conversion had been mooted before, and now with her hull probably maybe partially complete, but most of her actual gun and sensor systems aboard Hood, who would be freshly modernised and critically much faster than the King George V class and thus better suited for carrier escort operations, it's likely Hood would have taken Vanguard's historical place as the active British battleship in the 1950s, possibly even operating alongside HMS Vanguard, which may now be in its new role as the Royal Navy's latest carrier. Her survival beyond that point is questionable. The naval enthusiast in me wants to say that with her greater fame and survival past the 1940s, some movement toward keeping her as a museum ship could have been made, but at the same time the realist in me suspects the breakers yards in the 1960s would have been more likely, perhaps with some elements of her being preserved in a land-based museum. There is, of course, also the remote possibility of the carrier Vanguard conversion being the one to be modernised instead of HMS Victorious. This relatively easier job saving enough money to see Hood sent to the reserves instead of the breakers, and then maybe, just maybe, called up for action in a last hurrah with the fleet sailing to the Falklands in 1982. I mean, one can dream, after all. Now, in last week's video on why the Hood blew up, there are a lot of questions, shall we say. But since it's going to probably be a month or two before I get round to actually catching up to that particular episode in the dry dock, I thought I should probably answer some of the more commonly asked questions about the parameters of the research and calculations, etc. So I thought I'd do that now. So there's at least some proximity to when those questions are asked. The most common questions seem to be around